one of the premises for me is how we see Jesus will impact how we see our lives and his claim upon us. And so by looking at these must statements, we see that Jesus lived a life under obligation with a sense of call and claim that he could not avoid. And if we understand that about him, then we understand that his call and claim upon our lives is the same. That just as he lived by necessity, so are we called to live by necessity.
Welcome to another episode of Rethinking Christianity. On today's episode, we have Bishop Claude Alexander, who is the senior pastor of the Park Church in North Carolina. He is the author of a recent title called Necessary Christianity that was released in August, and it is a really compelling title, and it challenges us with some different thoughts and how we are following Jesus and what it means to follow Jesus. And so Bishop Claude, I really appreciate you coming on and taking the time to talk with me today.
Thank you, Blake. It's good to be with you.
Yeah, awesome. So before we get into the title, I'd love for our listeners to just kind of hear a little bit about you, kind of how you got to where you're at as a pastor and as a writer, and how that has kind of impacted your life.
So it's been my pleasure to pastor the people of the Park Church for now 32 years. That is it's been an incredible journey that the Lord has had both for the church and myself, calling me at the age of 26. And I accepted the Lord's call to ministry at the age of 17. So much of my life with the Lord has been the Lord seeing more for me than I ever saw for myself, causing people to see more than I see, and having them set the stage for that to be revealed. So whether that's the church calling me to be its pastor at that age, or whether it's been individuals like Leighton Ford seeing something in me and providing an opportunity for me to serve at Gordon Conwell, or my pastor, Bishop Walter Thomas, seeing a possibility for me and giving me the opportunity to preach at the Hampton University Ministers Conference. It's been the Lord investing in relationships of individuals who he sensitizes to what he sees, and they're providing the opportunity for that to be revealed. Yeah.
That's awesome. When did you feel called to write? When you began writing?
So I began writing in 2013, and it was in response to the death of my younger brother, who died at the age of 39 to squamous cell cancer of the tongue. And it hit me in a very deep place. And part of that, the way in which it hit me, there was a sense of not just grief, but guilt as the older brother being alive and him not living as long. And the way in which the Lord allowed me to deal with that was to look at how I would live my more years in the context of his less years.
Yeah.
And one of the things that he always wanted me to do was write. And so there was the impetus for writing, to honor him and his life.
That's awesome. That's cool. Yeah. I've always been kind of like inspired by the people that are disciplined enough to write and write and write. And I've tried to have moments where I write, but it's something I like the idea of more than the actual discipline of. And so, I think one day I'll eventually, maybe when I'm older, maybe when I'm a little older and wiser, I'll write more. So speaking of writing, so I'd love for us to kind of talk about this book. So it's Necessary Christianity, What Jesus Shows, What We Must Be and Do. And I found that title really compelling, because I think today, and you can speak to this, I'm sure, especially in America, we have many people that claim Christ and they claim to be followers of Jesus. But what we're kind of seeing is also, I feel like a lot of times, a misrepresentation of who Jesus is, who he truly is. And it paints Christianity in this light that is not accurate at times. And there's some things that have to be reconciled and dealt with, and we can't ignore them. But how much of this book maybe has a heart behind it from that perspective of how maybe Jesus has been misrepresented?
Yeah. So one of the premises for me is how we see Jesus will impact how we see our lives and his claim upon us. And so by looking at these must statements, we see that Jesus lived a life under obligation with a sense of call and claim that he could not avoid. And if we understand that about him, then we understand that his call and claim upon our lives is the same. That just as he lived by necessity, so are we called to live by necessity. Yeah.
When did you kind of begin this process in writing this title? Was there like any moment where you thought like this is a message that people need to pay attention to or to think through?
So each year I try to make it a habit of reading through the Bible in a year. And so in the course of reading over and over again these passages, certain things that just jump out. Bang, must. He must. I must. You must. And in looking at, in the past 10 years, seeing how so much of the faith has become commoditized and consumeristic, whereas causing one to see oneself more as a consumer than a disciple.
Yeah.
As a consumer, it is based upon choice. A disciple is based upon submission and yielding. And those are two very different ways of approaching the faith and approaching a life in Christ. And his life was not by choice, it was by way of submission. And that is that to which he calls us as well.
Yeah. And I think that is, I like what you mentioned about this idea of it being a kind of consumeristic, because I think that is a huge issue, and we see it more Western culture in churches where, and it's not all, these churches aren't necessarily bad in a sense, but the result is like what you mentioned. It's kind of like microwave Christianity. It's very quick. It's like, all right, here's faith, try and get it, and that's really it, and there's no like depth to it. And I think that's definitely something that I know a lot of people, when I have conversations with people who are moving away from the faith, or they're looking to maybe explore different options, the complaint I think a lot of times is seeing the fruit of that consumeristic Christianity rather than the fruit of what you are talking about in your book, of this life obligated in submission to Jesus, and that is reflected in all that we do, in the ways we love and the way we treat people. And so I would definitely agree with you that that consumeristic aspect is very unfortunate. It's unique to our culture in America, it seems. And it seems like that's something that a lot of people want to move away from, especially people that are leaving the faith. Would you say that that's true in your experience in conversations with people? Or
Yeah, I think that there are a couple of things happening. One is our initial encounter with Christ is often out of a need, right? And so that is it's very natural for the entry point to be very need-based and person-centric. The problem is it should not stay there. The maturity in Christ should grow beyond a me and need to a him and calling. And I think where people are finding the faith hollow and empty is where it never moves beyond a me and need to a him and calling.
Yeah.
Because God has created us for a calling, for a purpose beyond ourselves. And when individuals engage in a faith that does not hit them at that purpose level, they then say, there's got to be more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would agree with that. That's a lot to think about. It's a challenge. And I think it reflects in it deals with also how we engage with other Christians in our own discipleship in communities. Like what are we calling each other to, and what are we challenging each other with? And it's easy to just, everything in our culture is so fast paced and is about me. Like everything's about providing what I need. Everything, you saw with COVID in 2020, everything was adapted to supply and give need to the individual, whether it be like DoorDash or Zoom is huge now because it was a need for businesses and things like that. So it's really interesting to think about how all of that kind of permeates into the church. And I think the church is at times in a good way, we're contextualizing to spread the message of Jesus, but at the same time, we sometimes contextualize to allow these things to bleed in and take away the uniqueness of what it means to be Christian.
You in your observation about COVID, one of the things that I would say also paralleled that is that even though we pivoted to respond to people on a very individualized basis, what we also, at least what I found, is how easy it was for people to respond to serving during that time. We had an increase in people responding to serve the needs of others, to give of themselves and their resources for the benefit of others. Because even during that time when everything was hyper individualized, there was still a need within people, a deep need to go outside of themselves.
Yeah.
And that is a unique call that Christ places upon us. And we miss out on the opportunity to meet people in their deepest points of meaning and value when we do not provide that call and opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's it. That's really interesting. And I wonder if a lot of that has to do with, with the increase in serving, just being forced to slow down in some ways, and be forced to kind of realize, well, maybe the things that were so important to me when everything was at full speed are really not that important. And it's an unfortunate thing that it took that and not what you're talking about in your book, of this submission to Christ is what ought to be the thing that slows us down at times and
Yeah.
see the things that are truly important. There's a passage that you refer to. It's one of my favorite passages in the Gospels, in Luke 2:40 through 52, where you see Jesus in his wit, even at an early age, where his mother and father are looking for him, and he's there with the religious leaders of the time, and he's like, "What were y'all looking for me for? Didn't you know I must be about my Father's business?" And I love that translation of "I must be about my Father's business." Why is that passage, you think, important? And then in the latter part of that passage, it talks about Jesus growing in his own, obligation and submission. What did you find kind of in observing that passage important in your book?
So it is fundamental to understanding every other passage because Jesus in this one, his relationship with God, he kept in focus, right? My father, big F, right? It's Mary and Joseph looking for him, his earthly parents, but he understands that his primary submission is to the capital F. That's the first. And out of that focused relationship, the sense of the calling on his life, my father's business. Now, Joseph had a business. It was carpentry.
Yeah.
And Jesus was involved in that business, but the prime calling on his life was not carpentry. It was the call as Redeemer. That's the second piece. And then the third piece that comes to that is then representing that to them such that they would better know how to relate to him. That this sense of self is not only in terms of my relationship with God and the calling that is on my life, but it sets the way in which I relate and others are called to relate to me. And where that is clear, right, one is able to pursue the path that God has in a fuller way. To the degree in which that is not clear, then one is open to distraction and obstruction.
Yeah.
And so Jesus grew in this. It's one thing to have that at the age of 12.
Yeah.
But to then grow in that reality, such that at the age of 30, he is able to live fully into that reality.
Yeah. Yeah. At 30, it's on.
It's on there.
It's on. Yeah. Yeah. That's cool. Yeah. And that was something like when I read that passage, it was something that I had not noticed, or maybe I'd noticed or just not really thought about. It was just the reference to he grew. He grew from that point. And it's easy when we read, I think, the Gospels and look at Jesus and miss this human side. I mean, it's just very easy for me, at least, to miss that and see that, like, he was continually challenging himself. Like, something that I've really found interesting lately is spiritual formation, which is something that I had not really engaged with a lot. And I've mentioned on this podcast before. So I grew up in Southern Baptist culture. And it was kind of like, you get saved, and sometimes that felt like that was it. It's like you get saved and you serve in your church and you tithe and do those things. And then I started to read a little more about just some of the, the saints and the fathers and things like that about the spiritual formation. And one of the things that I found really interesting was, reading and thinking through like what it meant to practice the way of Jesus and seeing like moments where he secludes himself. He goes away. And then there's that passage that refers to, it's referring to all the works that Jesus did. If we had them all in writing, we wouldn't be able to contain them. Why? I think about all the developmental years of Jesus and like his spiritual formation, like what was he doing? And like, and we see that in that passage in Luke, that clearly over time he was continually challenging himself and being formed into this man and this Son of God to completely submit to the capital F Father's business. And that's something that I've been challenged with, is just what does it look like for me to grow in my spiritual formation, find moments of solitude, find moments of fasting, find moments to pray. And I think that we are challenged by that by Jesus. And I think sometimes we miss that easily.
You're absolutely right. And I know this is a conversation about a book that I've written, but one book that really captures what you've just been mentioning is a book entitled Anonymous: Jesus' Hidden Years and Yours, by Alicia Chole, Chole.
Cool.
And she posits that it's what God developed in Jesus's hidden years that gave him power for his public years.
Yeah.
And that his hidden years were 30. His public years were 3.
Yeah.
And it's in what God does in our hidden time that prepares us for the time in which we are in view. Yeah.
That's good. Yeah, I'll have to check that out.
Yeah.
And so that's I've thought about that a lot, and I'd not really noticed that in that passage in Luke. I'd love to hear, maybe in your own personal life, was there maybe a moment where, not necessarily specific to these I must statements, but like you realized that you had to take on this attitude of I must, or you were challenged with, how do I take this on more so, or where in my life do I need to move into this attitude?
So the notion of clarity, right? Where Jesus has just healed Peter's mother-in-law, right? And he goes away, to your point. He goes away for a time alone with God. And he is then met by the disciples, said, everybody is looking for you. This is great. We got this built-in market. And Jesus says, I must go to other places also. For to them I am also called. And Jesus recognizes that he cannot stay where he is, even though where he is, everybody would want to be. He must progress. He must move. There have been times in my life in ministry where, and I'll give a specific example, where I wanted to run for mayor of Charlotte, and I had significant backing for that: corporate backing, community backing, etc. I mean, I really wanted. And I asked the church to join me in a time of prayer, fasting. And I was at a conference, and in the midst of that conference, the Lord's message was, Charlotte is too small. That was it. Charlotte is too small. Boom. He dropped the mic. And he was letting me know that though this was something that I desperately wanted, that something that people wanted, that I could see myself doing, might have been very successful at it, that is not what he wanted. And it was smaller than what he had.
Yeah.
And so much of my life has included those moments where God has called me to a point of clarity and to a point of progression, that I cannot stay where I currently am. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. That's really good. Yeah, I think that from a lot of people, there's this, it's easy to get, like, I guess, comfortable in a way. Or even, as to your point, see where they think that they could be, or see where they want to be, and not realize that there could be something much greater that, Jesus is calling them to or challenging them with. And I think even on a much like a micro level, and just your spiritual life, the places where Jesus is trying to challenge us into, well, what is it that I must give up, or what is it that I must submit to, or what is it that, how should I treat people differently? There's a number of different things I think that we can truly be challenged with in that, and I think that that's something that I'm wrestling with all the time and thinking through all the time. On the opposite end of the I must statements, I'd love to hear your thoughts on, why do you think people that are followers of Jesus, a lot of times, and I'm guilty of this as well, we live in I might. Because I think that's huge.
Yeah. So, again, part of this is the whole point of maturity, right?
Yeah.
And so, an infant is very, very self-absorbed. And as that infant becomes a toddler and child, they naturally test limits, boundaries, right? And so self-assertion that seeks to negotiate a given end is just our nature. It's just a part of who we are. And maturity, both on a natural and spiritual level, is coming to terms with, there are certain things that are non-negotiable, right? That the calling and claim is not a matter of compromise and negotiation. It's a matter of trust and surrender. And because we are constantly being conformed into the image, that process is a constant one. So, what's the ultimate example? In the Garden of Gethsemane, I know all things are possible with you. If it be possible, let this cup pass from me. That's might. But then he says, nevertheless, not my will.
Yeah.
But thy will be done. That's the necessary.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And we see that moment is the moment that it was probably the hardest. Obviously. Yes. I mean, we see, you see the burden that he's beginning to feel. Yeah. And that is what you mentioned, those private years and those leading up to that is what prepared him for that, being able to say that statement, not my will, but yours. Yeah. And that is the challenge for each of us, is how do we take the posture of Gethsemane? How do we approach our lives with that? Yeah. I'd like to hear, I don't want to get into it too much, because I'm not I try to be not critical of the church too much, but I think there are places where, I think it's got to be, like I mentioned earlier, dealt with and talked about and reconciled in some ways. And I'd like to just kind of hear your opinion on, two of the words that I saw in your book, or in some of the descriptions of your book, is optional or haphazard. So Christians that are living kind of optionally or in a haphazard way. How do you feel, and we kind of hit on this a little bit, how do you feel that maybe that way of living has impacted the church in a negative way? From, I guess, an individual standpoint.
So it starts with how I view the nature of my life directs and influences how I feel the way in which I live is to be. So if I view my life as accidental, haphazard, right? Then I will view life that way. I will view it from optionality, haphazard. But if I realize that my being in this world was not accidental, it was intentional and purposeful, then I come to realize that the way in which I'm called to live is with intention and with purpose, which means that I do not live by optionality. That is not the prime driver. Yes, we always have choices. Yes, there are a variety of options for us. But the call of God upon my life is to seek what his purpose is for me and to find myself desiring that and yielding to it. Now, that is a constant journey process, but it starts with me recognizing that I wasn't an option. I am the intention of God. And that directs then every aspect of life.
Yeah. Yeah. That's definitely something to kind of think about, because it does seem like that is kind of our world, where the opposite of that is that everything is just kind of random. It's all just whatever. I'm going to do what I can to day make it. And that's not what Jesus is calling people to. And that's not what the calling of God is called people to.
Yeah.
There's a quote, in the book that I really like, and it hits on what you just talked about. The mature Christian life is one that realizes the necessity of focus and keeping focus. And I think that really does, you kind of take into fullness of what the message of a lot of this book is about. Did you have a chapter, maybe one chapter out of the book that was your favorite or that you enjoyed writing the most? I know that might be hard, because I know with writers, they're like, it's all good. I like all of it. So
yeah, man, come on now. So I think going back to the second chapter, the one of progression, and I would say that one on two fronts. One is the notion of accepting the dynamic nature of life in Christ. That is to say, that we are called to a constant process of growth. That's first. And so regardless of how long I am in this, there is still much more that God has.
Yeah.
So that's the first. The second is this notion that my life is to be lived by assignment and not preference. That's because so much of our decision making is guided and can be guided by preference, not assignment. Not assignment. And that is a lifelong issue as well. Constantly wrestling with preference versus assignment and purpose. And then the other part is the notion of continuity regardless of context. So the purpose of God continues even when the context changes.
Yeah.
Right. And in this day and age where context can change at the drop of a dime.
Yeah.
Right.
We saw that in 2020.
That's right.
Yeah.
Realizing that God's claim and call is continuous, even when the context changes. So yeah, that would probably be the one that,
Yeah, I heard a pastor one time say his thing was better at 70. We'll be better at 70. And I think that is very, like he talked about, he was like, I want to be sweet. I want to be a sweet, loving man, old man when I'm 70 years old because of my discipleship in Christ and because of what Jesus has done for me and in my life. And I'm challenged by that. It's like, how do we, that, like you talked about, continuity. And it's hard because like context, that doesn't necessarily mean, context as in where you're living or the job you're in, but seasons of life that can be difficult. And how do you process through all those different seasons of life? And that's a whole, I'm sure we could go on a long tangent on that, but I think that's and that's what, like, kind of what you mentioned in the Garden of Gethsemane is he still is he knows what the result is going to be, but I believe that even if he didn't know the result, that submission would still be there because there's him still, because his obedience and our obedience is a process of our growth and how it moves us forward. And so I think that's really, really good. That I'm gonna have to write that down. Continuity regardless of context.
Yeah.
I'd love to, as we kind of close out today, what would you hope for readers if they purchase your book? And we're going to put the link to the book in the show notes, and we'll push this on our Instagram page so that people can find your copy of your book. What is your hope for readers that would read this book?
My hope is threefold. One is that they would come to have a fuller understanding and appreciation of Jesus and how he approached and lived his life. Secondly, that they would be encouraged and inspired to see themselves as he saw himself. And be released to live their lives knowing how necessary they are and how necessary their service to God is for the world. Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, I think that readers that do take this book seriously and read it and take the calling of Jesus seriously, I think that they'll get that. And I think that this interview, hopefully for listeners that are listening, this will serve as helpful as a supplement to the book that I hope you'll go buy. Bishop Claude, I really appreciate you coming on to Rethinking Christianity. I think this conversation's been really insightful for me. And I just always am thankful to get to just learn from people that are wiser than I am.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to be with you.